Good morning. We're going to get started with our Bible class this morning. Appreciate your attention and your encouragement as well. I mentioned in worship a book by a person by the name of Gene Twenge, and Twenge has become kind of the leading expert right now in studying different generations. And by the way, Chris Fry, good-looking guy right there. Good looking. I don't know who your barber is, but big fan, real big fan. We just had to get it out of the way, you know? The people got to know. That's it. Anyway, as I was talking about Gene Twenge, she has compiled a lot of data. In fact, it's the largest data set that we have right now. She's pulled from global data, but particularly from trends in the United States. And so this session is heavy on data, and we're going to get to the purpose of it. A lot of times I'll do this session first, and it kind of points to where we ended up in worship. But I also want to make a really clear message at the beginning, is that we live in the age that we're in because of the way previous generations have lived in their age. So a lot of times it's really easy for us to be dismissive, particularly if you consider yourself in part of the older generation, to be somewhat dismissive of, the young people today, right? Or if you're a young people today, to be a little bit dismissive of, man, old folks, they just don't get it. I happen to be in this really weird stage of life called middle age, where people older than me think you're still a young whippersnapper, and people younger than me say, no, man, don't use skibbity in a sentence. It don't fit. So I'm in this weird place where I get it. I still think I'm young enough to do physical activity, but I'm also old enough to be on a first-name basis with my chiropractor. So it's an interesting place to be, particularly when it comes to life experience. I grew up playing video games. The generation before me went to the arcade. I still went to the arcade, but we went to the arcade for like special treats or birthday parties. The arcade came into my home with game consoles. That's a little bit more like what teenagers experience today. However, the car was a huge milestone in my life. I had a largely analog childhood, which is a lot more like the older generations today. So I really enjoy hearing both sides of this. The data we're going to look at paints an interesting picture, I think. We're going to talk specifically about the different age gaps that sometimes happen in the church. My first question here is, how does your relationship with technology impact your relationship with someone outside of your generation? By this I mean, if you're older, how often do you ask a young person to change your phone back into English from Portuguese because you don't know how you got there? Or for a younger person, how often do you ask about the older people in your life? How often do you ask about their experience growing up? I did a survey for a school. I did one of these at a school down in South Alabama a few months ago, and I surveyed the faculty. I said, give me the top 3 things that you struggled with when you were in middle school and high school. And that there was overlap. There were like 6 or 7 that were repeated over and over again. It was peer pressure. It was sexual temptation. It was body image. It was gossip. It was trying to figure out what I'm going to do in my next stage of life. Does that sound familiar? The sins are the same. The struggles are largely the same. What's changed, I think, is the packaging and the access to adult experiences at a much younger age. And that's a big deal. But we cannot, as spiritual people, especially as wise spiritual people, allow our experience with technology to negatively impact or prevent even a relationship with another generation, older or younger. So that's why we start here. So the silent generation is generally the largest, oldest generation among us. There are still just a very small few members of the greatest generation, which was right before the silence. But generally speaking, the silent generation is the oldest among us. They were born between 1925 and 1945. Every generationologist has their own classification. These are the dates that Gene Twenge puts in place, largely due to not just world events, but also technological innovation. They're typically less cynical and more trusting of other people, civil rights pioneers. One interesting thing, and we're going to look at a theme throughout several generations of the family, is that they had early marriages. They had a lot of kids at an early age. The silent generation married earlier in the 1950s than marriages were earlier in the 1950s than in the 1930s. So when you look at it, they were actually younger than any generation in the 20th century to get married. Nearly half of new brides in the 1950s were teenagers. The median age of first-time brides was right there around that 19 to 20-year range. The post-war baby boom in 1957, the birth rate was 3.8 kids per woman. I don't know how you get the 0.8, but we'll just move on. Parents of two-child families. They had grown up with one sibling, but now they're parents of 3 or more kids. Think about it for just a moment. That's a very different experience. I have one older brother. I have 4 kids. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm a desperate man. That's a very different experience. When you grow up with just maybe 1, maybe 2 siblings, but now you have children, the dynamics of your family are very, very different. So that's a life experience that has changed. Divorce rates shot up in the 1960s and 70s, and most divorces occurred between those aged 25 and 49. A lot of the things we're going to talk about today, we think in terms of contemporary issues. But what I hope you understand from our study this morning is that there's not much that's contemporary about it. Silents are the ones that started the divorce trend. Boomers kept it going. Divorce rates shot up, as I said, between the 60s and 70s. Contributing factors to the rise in divorce were rise of individualism. As we talked about, our society moved from agrarian to manufacturing, and then from manufacturing to technology. More technology in the home allowed women to join the workforce and achieve job equality, which changed the dynamics of family. Instead of always having one parent home, now both parents increasingly are involved in the workforce. Remarriage was very common, so this is an interesting thing. Marriage was still a very held in very high esteem. It was still very important, sort of. You think of the people among this generation that married multiple times. Elizabeth Taylor, 8 times. Johnny Carson, I think, was 4 times. Larry King, another 8-timer. So remarriage was common. 60% of men and 50% of women remarried within 5 years. So there wasn't necessarily an embrace of cohabitation. They still got married, just a lot. Silents were twice as likely as those in the greatest generation to believe that traditional gender roles were not necessarily better. Something else we think of in terms of a contemporary issue, but it's not. Within 2 generations, opinion flipped, with the greatest generation supporting traditional gender roles and most boomers disagreeing. So the silents were caught in between. And you think about the silent generation. They're referred to that because of an article in Time magazine in the 1950s that basically said, where are they? Well, if you look on the screen, there's 9 images of people who profoundly shaped culture in our country. So I think largely the title is sort of a caricature, which is usually an exaggeration of the truth. You think of the people in those photos, they've been a part of crafting legislation. They've been a part of changing culture for a very, very long time. But the silents were in between the greatest generation whom we put on a pedestal because of the unbelievable challenges that they encountered and persevered through. And then also the boomers, who were just the loudest, right? They were the largest generation at their time. And the silents were kind of caught in between. Gen X has a similar experience being between the boomers, the loud and the many, and the millennials, the loud and the many, and the sometimes whiny. But they're my people, I can say that. There were advances in healthcare during this time. So again, technological innovation created longer lifespans. There were fewer single elderly women today than in 1990. This generation was more educated than previous generations. They were the first generation in American history to have a majority of the members of their generation graduate from high school. You think about that, the first generation to have a majority of their population graduate from high school. We see an increase in the need for education, and especially where we are today. So there's consistent political power. People like Mitch McConnell, Trent Lott, Harry Reid, Nancy Pelosi, Newt Gingrich, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Sandra Day O'Connor, Anthony Kennedy, Antonin Scalia. Like, some of these folks have been in political power for roughly 140 years, it feels like. They've been in power. Like, they're not silent. They're not silent, but they're known for stability and calmness. Fewer have experienced mental distress. We saw that chart where again, the oldest generation just kind of flatlined, didn't poor choice of words. It stayed steady, right? It just definitely was not something that the mental side, the emotional side of things. There's a resilience that's come with their experience that older or younger generations have not had. Some of the major tech developments of the silent generation are the rise of modern home appliances, television, then color television, air travel, and cars. Everything has advanced in their time. Move on to the boomers, and my case as to why it's their fault for all the things. Just kidding, sort of. They were born between 1946 and 1964. One of the most interesting things to me is the fact that we have had a lot of boomers in office, particularly in the office of the president. In fact, over the last six presidents have all been members of the boomer generation, technically, from Gene Twinge's time period here. The last option we had, Donald Trump, was born in 1946. Kamala Harris was born in 1964. So it's interesting. They ran on being very different people, but technically still part of the same generation. So 5 out of the last 6 presidents have been from that generation. We've only had one silent generation president, and that was Joe Biden. So very interesting that higher office. The boomers jumped in early and have maintained their political influence there. They were 21.1% of the population in 2021. They're known for comfort with drug use and alternative medicines. There's a rise in self-focus as they got older. Choice was at the center of the boomer experience. And if you think back of the tumultuous 1960s, choice is really a part of all of that. They questioned things like the military draft. They strived heavily for gender equality. Countercultural kind of became the core value of their generation. But there was also an increase in mental distress and depression. They were having fewer kids and more divorce as they got older. There was this breaking of traditional views of sexuality. In a nationwide survey that was taken in 1967, 85% of U.S. adults said that premarital sex was wrong. In 1967, 85% of U.S. adults had that opinion. That number plummeted to 37% just 12 years later in 1979. So we went from 85% in just a little over a decade to 37%. This is a very key, pivotal moment in our country's culture that the boomers were largely at the center of. The sexual revolution was this battle between the boomers and the greatest generation, and the boomers won. As we mentioned earlier, silence leaned more towards the boomers when the dust settled. They also, I like to bring this up when my really dear friends and brothers and sisters in Christ tell me that the millennials are the ones responsible for all the wrongs. The first boomer president was also the first president to try to redefine the word is. And we think about today, if you remember, Bill Clinton was caught in a bit of a scandal, and one of his responses in his hearing was, well, it depends on what your definition of the word is. If you use it in the response, in the sentence, then that's anyway, I still contend on that one. But I mentioned that because today we're changing language, right? There's a sensitivity to the words that we use, to the pronouns that we use, things like that. This is not new. It's been around for quite a while, and it's been around and been popular among really influential voices. They also pioneered the fact that it was okay to talk about anything out in the open. If you think of the Oprah Winfrey Show and the sort of the empire that Oprah has built, that's largely because, as a boomer, she was willing to talk about anything. And if you look at the life of the silent generation, and even probably the greatest generation, there are a lot of things that they didn't talk about. But the boomers brought in this idea that we can really talk about anything, and they did. And so that kind of ushered in the entertainment age of life, where talking about anything also became the center of our entertainment. The world changed with the rise of the boomers, and I thought this was kind of an interesting observation that Twenge noted. She said that when the boomers were children in the 1950s and the early 1960s, the country was very child-focused, and you can see that in a lot of the sitcoms and a lot of the entertainment that was produced during that time. When they were rebellious teens, the nation was roiled by social change in the 1960s. When they were young adults, our culture experienced a fascination with the mystical in the 70s into the 80s. When they were building their careers in the 80s and 90s, the country favored stability, and we stoked the economy. So you can kind of see how the boomers both contributed to and were influenced by their times, just like every generation. We are largely a product of the generations before us, and we were born into that environment. The social movement protests of the 1960s declined in the 1970s as there was more emphasis on the changing of self rather than changing society. So again, you see this individualism kind of coming about. One interesting stat was the rise of self-help genre came into existence in the 70s. It wasn't really a thing pre the 70s decade. Google has this Google Google Word database, which is kind of an interesting database that's kept, and they catalog different words that are used throughout literature. If you go in and you look at that, you see that the words unique and identity surged in use in American books after the 1960s, particularly the word identity. And if there's one thing that maybe we struggle with talking about the most today, it's identity. Again, nothing new. Nothing new under the sun. Some of the major tech developments of the boomer age, I would put at the very top, the cassette tape, pretty great. You also have space travel. We went to the moon during their early childhood. But also something that's very significant that oftentimes gets overlooked is in 1964 was the introduction of the birth control pill. So this idea around sexuality and freedom, well, it's profoundly impacted by technological innovation. It broke the link between sexual activity and what was perceived to be the greatest consequence, which was pregnancy. And it now took away that consequence. So that comes out in 1964, and you got Woodstock and all of the other things in 69, 68, 69, leading into the 70s. Large amounts of attitudes and cultural thoughts are completely and directly impacted by technological innovation. We'll look at Gen X next. And Gen X has a really interesting mixture of celebrities associated with it. They were born between 1965 and 1979. They have a really interesting experience because they're both analog and digital communicators. They were the first generation on the internet, and they were the last ones to have a mostly analog childhood, which is a significant difference. They were the last ones to use rotary phones, which is just interesting to note, but mostly they were the last ones to go through high school without the internet. Think about that for just a second. When I was in high school in the late 1900s, early 2000s, we were starting to use the Alabama Virtual Library, which was the online database of books. My good man Dewey and his decimal system was on the way out, and computer-based research was on the way in. We had to have classes on how to navigate that in high school. So I'm in that kind of transition period of time with my experience. Oftentimes we don't go to the library anymore. We just go online. You think about how different of an experience the internet has created and influenced generations. So that Gen X, the last ones to use the internet, the last ones to go through high school without the internet. YouTube was started by 3 Gen Xers. You think of other things like the first web browser, Netscape, back then was called Mosaic. It was written by a Gen Xer in 1993. eBay, PayPal, those are Elon Musk. MySpace, Twitter, Uber, Napster. All of these platforms were created by Gen Xers. They worked at startups, but file-sharing software helped create the foundation of our world today. You think about Napster and LimeWire, those of you that smile when I say those things. And remember, we would start downloading a Dave Matthews album at 2 o'clock on a Friday, and if you're lucky, by like Tuesday of the next week, you would actually have that album, only to realize that it was a Conway Twitty album that somebody mislabeled. It was very stressful and very disappointing, and we had to learn to deal with that. Seriously, though, the way we access music and entertainment, the way you get to that is different. If you've ever listened to a vinyl record, you get like 4 songs, and then you have to get up and you have to flip it over to hear the next 4 songs. The experience is different. When you can just press a piece of glass and then it just plays and plays and plays for hours and hours and hours, that's a different experience. All of these experiences have created the world in which we live in today. Gen Xers are TV gen, big time, TV generation. They enjoyed and shared pop culture experiences because what was on TV or radio was the shared experience. Saturday morning cartoons were something that they always looked forward to, and then Gen X could then talk about at school the next week. You think of TV shows like The Brady Bunch that was on syndication that featured a blended family, so the cultural fabrics are changing. They learn the facts of life by watching the facts of life. And as we mentioned before, divorce was on the rise. So as divorce was increasing, people like Dr. Huxtable became sort of a surrogate father figure for an entire generation of people. The introduction of the Atari game console brought video games into the living room, and it was nothing like it is today, but that was the beginning of how we got to where we are today. The arcade was coming home instead of people going to the arcade. They were children of divorce. Nearly 3 times as many children in 1980 were living with a divorced mom or dad than had in 1960. Nearly 3 times as many children in 1980 were living with a divorced parent than had in 1960. Divorced families had become the normal. It was the rise and fall of the latchkey kid, if you remember that phrase. These were the students that would ride the bus to the bus stop, and then they would go home. But because, again, we've got more equality in the workforce, as women were no longer at home, they were now in the workforce working. Both parents are gone. So you have an hour or 2 hours in the afternoon where children are home by themselves. There's some life skills that kind of come from that. There's some independence that builds from that. That's a different experience. Organized after-school programs weren't normalized until the 1990s. Again, we legislate or we create things in response to the needs. And we didn't see it as a need until the 1990s. Schools were slow to recognize that mothers were no longer at home. Boomers and Gen Xers were raised in the fast life strategy, so most needed to work sooner than millennials and Gen Zers because we still had a largely manufacturing economy. Shorter childhood and longer adolescence was taking place and started with Gen X. Gen X married later than any generation in American history. Boomers married on average at 20 for women and 23 for men. Gen X married on average at 25 for women and 27 for men. Today, the median average for women to first get married has risen to 28 years old. This was from a stat I found in 2023. For men, it's now 30 years old. So we see everything is delayed. Lower age for first sex experience and higher age for first marriage. Having children is no longer tied to marriage. When it comes to married age, I didn't get married until I was 26, I believe, and at that time we had another minister on staff who got married, I'm pretty sure at like 7, but I think it was like later teen years, and he would always be like, man, when are you getting married? It's like, I'm trying so hard, man, you have no idea. But for him, by the time he was 26 years old, he had an undergrad, he had a master's degree, he had like 2 or 3 kids, he was a full-time preacher, he'd already had multiple jobs, and here I was, the youth minister, walking in flip-flops. Like, very, very different experience. Alex, don't wear flip-flops. All right? When that happens, you have to learn how to talk, because oftentimes we're using the same word bank, but we have a very different dictionary, right? His expectations for life at 26 were, rightly so, very different than my expectations for life at 26. Again, having children no longer tied to marriage, a key generational shift occurred during this generation. Only 11% of women ages 19 to 44, so the boomer and silent generation, had lived with an unmarried partner before their first marriage. But for those Gen X and millennials, that number went to 69%, had lived with someone, an unmarried partner, before their first marriage. So the expectation for marriage, the expectation for living together, the expectations for family are changing drastically. Divorce rates fell after the 1980s. Typically, if you married later in life, you stayed married longer. High self-esteem and focused on self was kind of a common trait of the Gen Xers. The use of the word self-esteem skyrocketed from 1970 to 1995. Boomers discovered self in the context of groups like protest and music festivals. Gen Xers did not. It was becoming a more isolated experience for them. A college degree became more important as we moved into a technology-based and information-based economy there. There was an importance of making a good living. It began to rise as developing a good philosophy of life started to decline. So it was more the pursuit of stuff and things and less of the pursuit of the quality of life. All right, now we move on to my people, the millennials. LeBron James, Jason Helton, both class of 03. Just wanted to mention that. We turned out about the same, I'd say. Maybe just the hairline, that's all. We were the most planned and the most wanted generation. With the rise of birth control and fertility technology, this was the most planned for generation in American history. Relentlessly self-confident, even when it doesn't always make sense. We lived through 9/11 and the housing bubble, the dot-com boom, and had to make sense of the world in the midst of those global events. After 2000, the first singular pronouns began to take off in literature, and a decrease in collective pronouns was noticed. Students started spending less time doing homework. However, the grades continued to go high. And this is a documented stat. So the idea of grade inflation is a real thing. There's actually data that shows that. By the millennial adolescence, grades went up, but study time went down. So evidence of boosting empty self-esteem can be found. When you have high confidence, but you have not faced any resistance in your life, it's a dangerous place to be because it's not built on resilience. It's built on just perception. And so then when you meet difficult circumstances, you don't know that you can do hard things because you've never done hard things. So doing difficult things sometimes is the right way to do it because it does build resilience. God did not design us to avoid difficulty. He did not design us to avoid pain. He designed us to heal really well. He designed us to reconcile relationships, both physically, spiritually, and emotionally. We heal well when we do things the way God designed. And I think that's one thing that my generation has had to learn. We grew up in an age of convenience, of modern technology that really it took away the resistance. It took away the difficulties. So then when life got difficult, as it will, we didn't always have the toolbox there to navigate it well. There was a growth in entitlement. This is one quote that she has. She said, "It's individualism promoted self-focused and unrealistically positive self-views during the 90s and much of the 2000s. College students' narcissism steadily rose. And then as the economic bubble burst, so did the bubble of narcissism." There was this picture of a great job market that you got to get this degree and you'll go have this great life. And then that job market didn't materialize. And now what do? You find a way to pay off all your debt, right? Digital natives for millennials. They're the generation that came of age as the internet was advancing. So the Gen X folks, they created the marketplace of the internet. The millennials were the first users. We were the first folks to come and kind of live on the internet. The framework was already there. There were analog methods of entertainment, music, and TV gave way to streaming and developing online communities. Movie and music companies struggled to navigate this migration. You think of there's a lot of tension between Metallica and Napster back in this time. 2004, thefacebook.com came out, and you had to have a .edu email address. I remember when it came to Faulkner, the computer labs were barren, desolate lands, and then all of a sudden, in about a week and a half period, you could never find a computer because we were always in there. And for some reason, they put the monitors down in the table. So we're also the generation that brought about scoliosis in a big way. But now college shenanigans lived online forever, right? Because of YouTube, because anything that was just really not good to do could be documented and shared and laughed at over and over and over again. This generation was decentralized. We were kind of without leadership for a while, of main voices there. You think of words and ideas kind of became the substitute for concrete goals. Think of things like Occupy Wall Street that were largely led by millennials. But very highly educated. This generation was the first generation in which more than 1 out of 3 had a 4-year degree by their late 20s. The social norm had shifted to pressuring millennials to go to college. The expectation was there now that you go to college. They were very high earners, despite what we may think. By 2019, households headed by millennials actually made more than silent boomers and Gen Xers, even when you account for inflation. But I don't know if that's still the truth after the last couple of years, just speaking for my household. We'll keep moving. Gen Z. Gen Z was born between 1995 and 2012. They were 23% of the U.S. population in 2020. This is a massive group of people. They favor things like gender fluidity. There's a rise in LGBTQ community. They were growing up slowly. They have this delayed adulthood. In fact, there was a new stage of life that had been introduced with this late adolescence that had developed. They were drinking and having sex and driving later in life. Milestones and rites of passage have changed. As I mentioned before, when I was growing up, when I turned 16, that was a big day. I lived about 150 yards away from a grocery store, and I lived on a hill. So if you tripped at just the right angle, you would fall all the way down and stop rolling in the parking lot of the grocery store. It was irrational to drive the car, all right? I mean, it's just too close. But when I turned 16, you absolutely better believe, I grabbed the keys, I told Mom, we need milk, bread, I'm not asking, we need something. I'm going just to get a pack of chewing gum because I can drive the car. Driving that 150 yards in my car, mostly in neutral downhill, was to me like driving to the border of Mexico or Canada. It was truly freedom. But today, folks don't care about that. There are a lot of teenagers that don't have a desire to get their license. They don't need it. What was the symbol of freedom for me was a set of car keys in a vehicle. For them, is their device. So it's a similar experience, but it's packaged differently. And this is where we have to learn to calibrate the language a little bit, because both of us at that stage of life are striving for independence. We want to be seen as mature and having it together, but we're still learning how to walk in so many ways. They're considered to be very racially conscious, but also research is showing they're dissatisfied, depressed, and pessimistic. They're also, I've found, ready to find a cause to promote. But part of the challenge is that we don't always articulate a good cause for them to get behind. Again, we have to calibrate our language. They're very creative. They have some amazing tools at their disposal, but I'm not sure that as adults we always take the time to learn those tools so that we can then mentor them how to use those tools in a godly way. A lot of the research right now has kind of a sky is falling connotation with Gen Z and also Gen Alpha, whatever they're going to end up being. This would be the generation of my kids. It's not all gloom and doom. The reason adults are nervous about this stuff, guys, is because of all the stuff we talked about in worship. Like, there's some real negatives to it, but there's some real positives to it as well. And in the church is the place where we should be really good at having nuanced conversation. We should be the people that are really skilled at kind of pulling out, this is really useful. This is how we leverage this to amplify the message. But you're still learning how to think. You're still learning how to communicate. So let's put some guardrails over here until you're ready to use it to its fullest potential. Technology is powerful. Whether it's positive or negative largely depends on us. Why are we starting here? Well, because the picture that you see young people growing up in today, if you don't consider yourself a young person, was painted by your generation and the generations prior to it. There are 4 particular revolutions I want us to look at briefly that occurred during the 1960s and the 1970s. The tech revolution, the sexual revolution, the women's movement, and the youth movement. And these were identified by Dr. Jeffrey Jensen. 2 in particular that I think are relevant to our conversation today. Manufacturing economy versus a knowledge economy. If you grew up in a manufacturing economy, there's a set of expectations that are not the same today. Manufacturing today is 6 times the amount it was in 1950, but it uses half of the amount of the workforce. Think about that. It is 6 times the amount it was in 1950, but it uses half the amount of people. There's an extended education requirement, right? As more people get more education for longer, that pushes all of the family milestones back. If you're in college longer, then you usually get married later. If you get married later, generally have kids later. It takes longer to prepare for a knowledge economy than it did a manufacturing economy. So that's how that delayed adulthood kind of started to develop. And then technology was an accelerant of some of that. As I mentioned before, the birth control pill was innovated there and introduced in 1964. It broke the link between sexuality, reproduction, and marriage. Most people begin being sexually active today 10 years or more before marriage. Without the birth control pill, then there's the consequence of pregnancy that's much greater. That changes that expectation. That changes that cultural norm. There's a longer period now where kids are making and breaking relationships that were designed for intimacy, that were designed to bond deeply and for a lifetime. And we're going to talk really in depth about that in our 3rd session, the way God designed us to bond to one another. We use that word sex a lot, and that's not the word to use. It's intimacy. But now the approach and the attitude towards intimacy have changed. What does a generation look like when we raise them on work smarter, not harder? When you preach that over and over again, and then we enter into a digital age where the tools of our day allow us to work not hard at all, and only smarter, where everything can be automated, everything can be done through an AI assistant, or everything can be done through a voice command and not actually having to go out. We have so many teenagers at Madison that do not cut grass, and I'm just looking at them like, you're just refusing money at this point. We live in a place where people will pay other people to cut their grass because they want to go play. You can make a lot of money, but they don't do. Some of that is because things like travel sports, things like extracurricular activities at school become all-consuming. The calendars are taken up by all of those events. And so there's not room for these other things. I cut grass for 9 years. I learned how to talk to people that were older than me through cutting grass. I had one particular lady that she paid me like 3 times the amount that I charged her. It took me about 30 minutes to cut her yard. And then I talked to her for another hour, just conversing, because she was kind of lonely. I have always had older voices in my life, and not even by my own pursuit. God just always knew that I needed a lot of chaperones, apparently, growing up. But my life has been enriched because I'm at least informed about a different way, a different life experience that has occurred. I also have people that I could call on in an instant, they'd be there. If I find myself in a really difficult situation, I don't just have one number, I have a list of people. When we stay in our own little cocoon, when you guys just stay up here in this group and you don't ever ask anybody else in this room, hey, tell me about when you were a teenager. Tell me about your first car. When our interactions are limited to just instruction, hey, I need you to help fix my phone. Okay, thanks. It's just transactional. We're not designed for transactions. We're designed for community and for relationship. Paul describes the body of Christ as a body, the church, his people. And we work together. It's a living, breathing organism. And when we allow ourselves to compartmentalize based exclusively on age, I can make a strong case that that's bigotry. In James, he talks about segregating yourselves based off of appearance. But sometimes we do that based solely off of age, and that's not right. That's anti the church that God has established, and yet we allow ourselves to just drift into that and be okay with that. We can't do that. When we raise a generation and work smarter, not harder, sometimes we look up and we realize we've raised a generation that doesn't know how to work hard in some of the ways that the rest of us do. And it's not necessarily their fault. So grab a teenager and go pick some weeds in your yard and then take them out for ice cream. Just tell them about the ice cream part. They'll show up at your house like, wait, yeah, it's part of it. Don't lie, but, be smart. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, and I left my Bible right here. Turn with me there real quick. It is Bible class, after all. And this is ultimately where we were going with this study. The data, to me, is very interesting. It's very enlightening to get a fuller picture. It's kind of like we oftentimes navigate life with this perception of like a black and white photo or even like a coloring sheet. And that's how we learn history. You kind of have the facts and the dates and a few names maybe. But when you look at the actual living experience, it's this full, vibrant picture of how we got to where we are today. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, beginning in verse 21, Paul writes, "The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. And on those parts of the body that we think less honorable, we bestow the greater honor. And our unpresentable parts are treated with greater modesty, which our more presentable parts do not require. But God has so composed the body that giving greater honor to the part that lacked it, that there may be no division in the body, but that the members may have the same care for one another. If one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice together. Now you are the body of Christ, and individually members of it. And God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, and miracles, gifts, healing, helping, administrating, various kinds of tongues. Do you but earnestly desire the highest gifts, and I will show you still a more excellent way." I believe a part of that more excellent way is all of us working together. If you are someone that is young and you have not heard from people that are 10, 15, and 20 years older than you what it was like to navigate childhood or what it was like to get through high school, then you're missing out on a really rich experience. And you're going to start to hear that they got uncomfortable and nervous because their voice cracked when they spoke publicly. And they were really nervous when the first time they talked to a girl and she said yes to go on a date. And you're going to get really nervous the first time that they talked to the guy and he said yes and took him out on a date. You're going to realize you have a lot more in common than Satan wants you to realize. You're also going to hear a richness in relationships. If you've never talked to somebody that's been married for 40 and 50 years and heard how they met and heard what they navigated through their early years of marriage, then you're missing out on enriching your life. And if you're here and you've been on that side of things and you've not had a conversation, you've not taken a young person to lunch, you've not shown up at a ball game to cheer for them, to sit with their family, then you are missing out on an enriched experience. You're missing out on God's purpose for your life being here. We are not designed to be consumers. We don't just come to worship so that we get filled and then we go on about our day. We come here to be filled and to also help others, to fill their cup as well, to be an active part of each other's lives. And I've only been here for a short period of time, but I've already heard multiple stories this morning of how people are doing that on a regular basis. That's wonderful. I'm afraid that that's not the norm. But let's make it the norm. Let's let Maple Hill be a part of making this the standard of not just coming and keeping attendance and having this mutual appointment weekly, but being an active part of each other's lives, to be the church of Christ, to build each other up in love. The reality is, Romans 3:23, it tells us that we all have equality. We all fall short of the glory of God. We are all also shaped deeply and spiritually by technology, and therefore we all need each other. That's why we have these kinds of conversations, not because they're always comfortable, but because they're necessary, and because we are necessary in each other's lives. If you only know your family here at this place, now is the time to change that. Now is the time to be the church. Now is the time for us to be together. I did not change that, so don't worry about that one. We'll come back to it. I really hope that you'll consider sticking around this afternoon for our final two sessions. That last one, it's not exclusively for parents or grandparents. It's for, as was mentioned earlier, Adam said, the mentoring side of things. If you have had a different experience from what our teenagers and younger have had, we need you to come and be a part of that conversation. We need to learn how to talk to each other and to talk to each other well. God has designed his body to work together, to be healthy, and to bring about joy. I am honored to be with you today. I hope you'll join us for lunch and then join us for our afternoon sessions. Let's close in prayer and we'll be dismissed. Father in heaven, we're grateful for the opportunity to gather in your name, to come before your throne today, to worship you, to praise you, to encourage each other, to hold each other accountable. And I pray that as a result of our time together, that the words that you have penned would take root in our hearts, give us a greater level of observation, help us to be able to see the opportunities that you're putting before us for the relationships that you will bless, that you have promised us, that you will grow. Help us to not let potential uncomfortable conversations or interactions or even the past, even hurt of the past or experiences in the past to prevent us from moving forward in a way that glorifies you and puts us in accordance with your will. We thank you so very much for your church, for your kingdom that Christ has established and that we get to be a part of. It's through his name we pray. Amen.